Hi, I'm Annie Fitzsimmons. I'm your Washington REALTORS legal hotline lawyer, and I am thrilled today to be joined by John Manning. John, tell us who you are.
Thank you very much. I'm John Manning, designated broker at RE/MAX on Market in Seattle.
And John, by all standards, is not an old timer to our industry, but John has spent a lifetime bringing contract parties together across the conference table in scenarios where it seems like a successful outcome is not the most likely. And I'm grateful that he has agreed to come share some of the principles that he's learned about good communication, even negotiation maybe, with us in this video series. So with that, John, one of the ways that lawyers, and I'm not going to brand every lawyer with this mentality, but you know, kind of the theme of lawsuits certainly is one party wins and one party loses. And you got this big void between those two outcomes. I have a feeling you're going to tell me that's not how you should be negotiating real estate transactions. Is that right?
That's true. That's true. And it's not just attorneys. I grew up in an Irish household, Annie, so everything is negotiated and it's always win-lose. But it is true. A win-lose mentality is likely to cause failures. And I think that there is a completely different mentality in a real estate transaction, as you mentioned, where you have different essentials, like, for example, good communication, relatedness with the other broker on the other side of the table. Because if you don't have good relatedness with that person, then they fundamentally it means that they don't have enough information to act on. Your professional credibility going into the interaction is really important. How you present yourself, how much you know, how well you manipulate the information that is available to you for the good of the transaction. The promise of trust is critical. You're not going to be besties necessarily with the other broker, but they ought to feel that they can trust that you'll do the right thing. And then lastly, I think there always has to be clarity of outcome between the parties. Everyone needs to know, why are we doing this anyway? What are we here for?
Okay, so I just heard you give us 4 bullet points that we're going to discuss in this video as maybe our first step down the path towards creating positive outcomes between a buyer and seller. Okay, and I heard you say good communication, professional credibility, the promise of trust,
yes,
and clarity of outcomes.
Yes.
Good communication. As the hotline lawyer, it's very frustrating to me on behalf of our entire industry when I get an email, and I get these emails all the time, where a broker will send me an offer. Hopefully it's not an already negotiated purchase and sale agreement, but very often it is. But they'll send me an offer and they'll say, I don't get what the broker on the other side of the transaction means by this. What do they mean?
Right.
Why is that broker sending me that question, right? I mean, take it from there.
Sure. Well, you know, the seller wants to sell and the buyer wants to buy. That's the starting point, right? And anything that gets in the way of that is going to have consequences. It can be legal consequences, it can be financial consequences, or it might just be a failure of the transaction and a waste of everybody's time. Maybe there's no consequences except it wastes everybody's time. But there are a bunch of things that we as brokers are responsible for. We're carrying the quality of the communication. We're carrying we're representing our clients, and in many cases our clients might never even know if we're not doing a great job of that representation. And
so in that scenario though that I was talking about, it seems so obvious and yet it doesn't happen. For the broker on the other side, why are you sending an email to the legal hotline lawyer?
Right.
Why aren't you picking up the phone and calling the broker on the other side of the transaction and saying, I'm not sure what you meant by this.
Yeah.
Is that what you mean by good communication, or is there even more to it?
It's like that famous line in the movie, what we have here is a failure to communicate. I mean, it's as simple as that. If I do not take into account the other side's needs and wants and fears are really important too, then I'm working from a perspective that might miss the mark entirely when I'm dealing with the other side.
So I represent the buyer, I've never met the seller. How do I know what the seller's fears are? in a very fast-paced market, right, where a buyer looks at a house today and maybe they only even look at it online and they make an offer by noon today.
Yeah.
How do I, as the buyer's broker, gain an appreciation for the seller's fears?
Well, I think it starts with an understanding on the part of both brokers, and most brokers will find themselves at different times in their career in the buyer's seat, in the selling seat, the listing seat, and I think it starts with understanding what the other side needs. That doesn't mean you're going to give them everything that they think they need or want, perhaps would be better, but at the very least we should know what it is what are their fears, what are sellers' fears? Does it mean that, if the market is really hot, does that mean that sellers have no fears? I can tell you firsthand, they have nothing but fears, because the higher the stakes, the worse it gets in many ways.
Okay.
So just anticipating the other side's needs, understanding what are their fears.
So again, if I'm representing the buyer, how do I know the seller's fears? Are you saying this is just something that I have to gain through experience in the industry? Do I pick up the phone and call the listing broker and say, what's your seller afraid of? How do I get there?
I think that's the golden rule, is pick up the phone and call the other broker. And I think picking up the phone and calling the other broker is probably the most powerful negotiation tactic or tool or anything in the entire industry. If you cannot relate to the other side, find out what it is they want to tell you and tell them the things that are important to your client, and listen carefully. When I'm a listing broker and I ask a buyer's agent, tell me a little bit about your buyer's financing, the number of missed opportunities that happen when the other broker just says, oh yeah, they're really well qualified. Well, gee, thank you very much. What about more? What about details? What about, yes, they have reserves. Yes, they have long tenure in their employment. Yes, they have excellent credit. Please call the lender. The lender has been in the business for 20 years and is very reputable and is competent. How about you show me that you know what I'm worried about as a listing broker if you're on the buyer's side?
Okay, I like that. So then, going back to how does the buyer broker know what the seller's fears are, it might not be a question of what are you afraid of, but more what are your seller's priorities, or what's really important to your seller, right? There could be do we ever have a scenario where sellers' highest priority might not be the purchase price, for example?
Absolutely. There's a number of different levers that we pull and push, and we can get into those in another video. But for example, risk. Different people experience risk differently. Some people are terrified by the unknown. They cannot necessarily process things until that unknown is resolved. Other people don't care. And so one person could see an offer and go, oh my goodness, the highest price, but it only has a tiny down payment and a whole bunch of contingencies. I don't care, it's the highest price. Another person will look at that same dilemma and say, wow, here's a different offer that has buttoned down all the contingencies in my favor as seller, but they can't pay as much, and we would have established that obviously, but now in an apples to apples comparison, I have high price, high risk, lower price, lower risk. It's not a given whatsoever that 10 different sellers would make the same choices.
Okay, so then the second thing that you said, because I think I'm hearing a little bit how we're going to segue into, the second thing you said is professional credibility. Mm-hmm. So if I've got it doesn't really matter who I'm representing this transaction, buyer or seller, I come to the broker on the other side of the transaction and I start describing my buyer or my seller. Tell me how that plays into this notion of professional credibility as one of these pillars on which a solid negotiation is based.
Yeah, well, human beings operate based on relatedness, right? If you don't have relatedness with another human being, there's little to be said. In fact, typically you'll head for the door as fast as you can. And the same principle carries through into negotiating a contract. When a buyer's broker calls a listing broker and expresses interest on behalf of their client, they're not only, claiming a place in line to buy that house for their buyer, but they're also distinguishing their buyer in a way that ultimately, if you're successful, you're gaining the confidence of the listing broker. You're establishing, we've done our homework. I'm calling you ahead of time. I am a fellow professional that is here to find out your needs as a listing broker, or really the needs of your seller through you, the listing broker, and I'm receptive. You know, does your seller need something that might not be obvious from the listing?
So I'm hearing you say that professional credibility is actually happening on two planes simultaneously. When you first said professional credibility, I'm thinking you mean my reputation in the industry, which I suspect you are, at least in part. But you're also talking about professional credibility established in the instant with the communication that I deliver to you. You might never have met me ever before. But how do I come across as a professional? Do I come across with a mastery of the forms, for example?
Right.
Do I know my buyers' real finance? Is it just have I done my own background research into their financial ability, or am I just relying on the piece of paper that their lender gave them who met them by phone only the night before?
Right.
That's what you're talking about,
yes,
right?
Very much so. Of course, if you have a long history of a long track record of success in the industry, that's an easy thing to use in establishing or furthering your professional credibility. But you could also become cocky. And personally, as we begin to work with the younger generation of real estate brokers that are coming into the industry, we're seeing some ridiculously smart people coming in. They don't have that long track record, but they're really intent on doing the very, very best job they can do. And it shows when they talk to you. They don't have 75 deals to establish competence under their belt, but they've shown up. They've done their homework. They're not trying to fake it till they make it. They're
right.
They're in the game.
A really quick war story. I had a broker tell me one time that and this was a few years ago, before she was receiving 80 offers on a transaction, she received 8. And in this particular transaction, she had let people know that even though this property didn't look like a condominium, it was a condominium, and you needed to write the purchase offer on a Form 28 purchase and sale agreement. She received 8 offers. One of them was written on the Form 28, and it wasn't the highest price buyer, but she recommended to her seller that the one broker who is probably more likely than the others to get the transaction closed was the broker who paid attention to the instructions and did what was necessary to create a transaction that actually could close.
Yeah.
That's what you're talking about.
That's a perfect example, because it's not about that one extra paragraph in 28 over 21. It's that this person is somebody that is going to work with us. We're going to be collaborative. We ultimately share a goal of closing this transaction, and we might not agree on every single thing. Obviously, we will never agree on price. A buyer will only pay the price they are forced to pay. But however, we can agree that this broker has professional credibility, and they're there to do the right thing, and they're listening to your needs as the listing broker, and then they're executing accordingly. That's really impressive, and it doesn't happen as systematically as we would like it to in the industry.
And I think that it might be hard to achieve professional credibility. There's a lot of background work, but boy, you can destroy professional credibility with one word, right? You can make one promise that's false. That the agency law duty to exercise honesty and good faith in all of your dealings. It kind of sounds to me that that's a little bit like what you're talking right there. It's not, and it's also reasonable skill and care, right?
Absolutely.
You got to do your background homework so that you can bring credibility. And when you say something, the other side has to know that they can rely on that. The third thing you said was the promise of trust. Is that then feeding into the promise of trust?
It does. If somebody believes they can trust, obviously if you've never encountered a person before in your dealings, then it's very difficult to say, oh yes, I trust you. But you should at least have an assessment of that person's professional presentation of themselves and their client, that you will, in the course of this transaction, end up in a place where if something goes wrong, that you can indeed pick up the phone and say something has gone wrong.
Right.
And not just going back to your win-lose categorization, the image of attorneys lining up against each other, and they each have their list of must-achieves, and then they have all of the low-value things that they can throw those out there as if they're being, bestowing goodies, but they're not really giving anything up on their client's side. That doesn't really work in real estate. We all know the pitfalls of the over emotional reaction that can cause an entire transaction to tank. So it's not all about, I need to get this, you're not getting that. It's how does the other person feel about not getting that? That's super important in the whole thing, because a person will walk away. I remember vividly learning for the first time about that transaction. It was a fabulous story, actually. The two parties that argued $50,000 worth of legal fighting over $3,000 worth of, was it Delante? Was that the one? And they went. And when the judge finally said, I'm not giving anybody damages on that particular lawsuit, can you imagine how those people felt? They must have felt like idiots.
Yeah, I can't imagine. Unfortunately.
Am I allowed to say that? I mean, I don't mean to call anybody idiots, but I mean, $50,000 of fighting, why were they fighting? Not for the $3,000, but for the emotion.
Well, that brings us then to clarity of outcome, right?
Yeah.
Because we don't want to spend $50,000 fighting over a $3,000 nut. What is our clarity of outcome? And so that also puts us into the contrast of the two models, where if a lawsuit is win-lose and you're trying to bring us to a transaction that's obviously win-win, clarity of outcome, do we achieve clarity of outcome at the time of mutual acceptance and then all we have to do is arrive at the closing table?
Yeah.
Or is there something that happens along the way to make clarity of outcome be a constant?
Yeah.
Tell me about that.
Well, it's a little bit like getting married, right? Mutual, you're married. Following morning, if I get up and I start throwing my socks around and the place is just a, path of destruction when I walk through it, my marriage is not going to be very happy at that point in time, right?
Right.
And it's the very same thing in a contract. You walk up to the aisle on the wedding day and you make promises, right? And then the following day you start fulfilling on those promises. And it's not just, anybody that's ever been in a relationship knows it's not just actually fulfilling on the promises, it's showing continuously that you're fulfilling on the promises, right?
Right.
It's not enough to love the other person, you got to tell them that you love them. And it's a funny example, but it's real in the sense that you have to continuously reinforce why we are here, that you can trust me, that I will, consider where we are at as objectively as I possibly can without giving up the representation of my side.
Okay, so like, for example, then, where we have the Form 90 FIRPTA, that's the one that the buyer can deliver. If the seller hasn't delivered their 22E, their FIRPTA certificate, buyer broker might deliver that to the listing broker and say, look, my buyer does not want to terminate the transaction. We're sure it's an oversight that the 22E didn't get delivered,
right,
but we really do need that 22E. Something like that. You've got to, let me back up. Can you always just be a nice guy?
No, and that's difficult for some people. Being confrontational can sometimes be part of the job, and that does not mean that you're switching into win-lose mode, although I suppose momentarily you could.
Right.
But
okay, so let me pick up on this example then. Nice guy might say, I'm just not going to deliver the 90 FIRPTA.
Yeah.
But my buyer's got to have that, and buyer broker's got to have that 22E in their file,
they
right?
absolutely do,
okay,
yeah.
So go.
Well, buyer's broker doesn't want to be paying the tax. For starters, right? So knowing the consequences, that's the clarity of outcome, right? I, as buyer's broker, do not want to be on the hook for being told that my buyer just got saddled with a $15,000 tax bill because of an oversight on my part, or I was too nice to ask for a form. I think then the relatedness and the professional credibility comes in where I don't just text the other broker, send me over 90, whatever it is, or whichever form, because there's numerous examples of this, but rather I call that broker up and I say, hey, we do have a situation here where we have an uncertainty, and with that uncertainty comes a possible legal liability. And as brokers, legal liability is never a good thing. Even if you win, it's so expensive to win. It's the best fight you'll ever be in is the one you're not ever in, right?
Very well said.
And so I do need this form because escrow has got to, ascertain and apportion taxes on behalf of the IRS and so on and so forth. And I need your help with it, and I must have that today.
Okay.
But here's why. I'm not just telling you your job and get this over to me today or else. I'm saying to you, look, there's a very compelling reason as brokers why we want to move this transaction to a close with no disputes and no drama, and here's what I need.
Okay, so I think we got to wrap up this video, but in a future video I would really love to pick up with you just said, I'm going to deliver in this way, and I'm going to communicate why it's important. A lot of times I hear from brokers who on the other side are going, you can't tell me what to do. I've been in this business a long time, and it's not just in the way it's communicated, but it's also in the way the communication is received, right?
Yes, absolutely.
It works both ways.
Yes.
So I also want to spend a little time talking about some of the fundamentals, kind of the legal principles of negotiation, but I really think we should call this video.
Great.
And so in the next video, I want to pick up how you receive that information. I also want to maybe talk about some of the principles of negotiation that are really important for not the art, but the legalistic part of it. And we'll cover that maybe first in the next video.
Fun.
So if you have questions about this topic or any other, send an email to me, legalhotline@warealtor.org. If I can't answer the question, I will get John on the phone and have him help me come up with an answer. I won't text him and ask him that question. Thank you for being a member of the Washington Realtors.